Here, I am many things. I am a mother, I am a policy wonk, I have a PhD, I am a musician, I am the sister to my sister Susie here, and Susan and I also have a big brother Andrew. I grew up in Canberra, don't hold that against me. I'm a community development obsessive, I'm an occupational therapist, and I am a tragic overcommitter. I'm sure I'm completely different to all of you in this room. So our family, Susan, my family, I have two children myself and my husband Dan. My kids are 4 and 2, so forgive me if I forget what day it is just at the moment because they keep me on my toes. And our mum and dad are still living here in Canberra in the same house where we grew up. Mum and dad are teachers, and I often sort of see myself in the context of my family history. My father's one of these really, really daggy family historian genealogist people, and he talks a lot about sort of the importance of our family history. And so I think from a very young age I was well aware that, on my mother's side I grew up in a family where community was always important, and I guess I was never destined to be an accountant, being the daughter of 2 teachers from sort of community country backgrounds. And yet I find it really interesting that often when I tell people I have a sibling with a disability and that I'm an occupational therapist, or I have been in the past, they're like, oh, well, that must be because of your sister. And I'm like, well, probably. I mean, obviously, you're not completely not there. But yeah, I guess I tend to sort of try and describe myself in the broader context of my family and my family's history. So I guess that's why I'm trying to introduce myself as myself and as a member of a family. My current relationship with Suze is very close, but it hasn't always been like that. It began with, so Susie, I would just like to point out, is my big sister, so I am the younger one. And our relationship is close now, but it hasn't always been that way. It began with me treating Suze as a speed hump when I was on my way to get a toy that I might want on the other side of the room, because I was the first to crawl. And while you were an adept roller, I could always get over you to whatever toy you were heading for faster than you could. Now, the other thing that happened for us was that I'll talk more about tomorrow. Suze and I are presenting tomorrow morning. Suze moved out of home when we were kids, when you were 9 and I was 7, and that was hideous. Yeah, I'll talk about that tomorrow. And it was difficult, but it also had, and I mean, it's really difficult for me to say this, but it actually had benefits. For me, it meant that I could be a completely narcissistic girl and teenager, like most teenagers kind of are. I never had to even think about anybody else in the world when I had friends come over, and our family spent a year in a camper van in Europe, and we knew that Suze was maybe not well looked after, but looked after while we were gone. And I think that these days it would be possible to go and live in a camper van in Europe with you, Suze, but at the time, like, there was nothing. There were no ramps, we're pretty old. As Rhiannon was saying, her journey that she kind of came back from living overseas. I went to Sydney for uni and moved away from my family and had this great time in my 20s, and then went and lived overseas for a couple of years, kept on having a great time, kept on completely sort of not just ignoring Suze, but my whole family, like I was in the zone. I was kind of out there having a great life. And then I came back to Canberra when I was about 27 and really reconnected with all of my family, including Suze, and it's been really great to be back in town hanging out. And I think, as, again, another parallel with Rhiannon's story, I think that coming home has been the thing that's been a catalyst for us in many ways to see how my life has diverged from Susie's life. I mean, it was always pretty different, but I think that it really brought it home for Mum, seeing me out of the pub, which was confronting enough, and Suze in pyjamas in bed at 7:30 in her group home. So I think that, there's a really interesting dynamic when you have siblings to be able to be doing that comparing thing and like, how come what's happening for Alison is not happening for Suze, and let's think about how it could possibly happen. I won't take too long because Maureen's got some awesome stuff to say, but I just want to sort of really point out a few things that I think have really shaped my relationship with Suze. And I think the first one is, of course, just who we are, like as people. And I'd also like to point out that I think that's also what's shaped my relationship with my brother, who we are. So I love my sister, I love my brother. I see my brother who lives about 100 metres away from Suze maybe once, twice a year. Like, he's just a laid-back guy. He's a guy. He doesn't call. He doesn't sort of return calls. Suze doesn't return calls either. But anyway, and so I think that who we are, that Suze and I really kind of, I don't know, I think we sort of vibe off each other and we have a great time hanging out. And even though we love our brother, he's kind of got his own life. Who we are has really shaped our relationship. I think it's also really important to point out that I've never been afraid of Suze. I've never, even though I've developed pretty fast reflexes pretty early in life to get away from the hair grab, I've never felt like I've lived in fear from Suze having some maybe anything happening really, and I think that that's made things quite easy for me to be able to just hang out freely with Suze. So I've also, my parents, I don't think it would be fair to say that Mum and Dad have ever expected me to have a really involved relationship with Suze. I never had a sense when I moved to Sydney or when I went and lived overseas that my parents were giving me a guilt trip about that. And I think that as a result of that, just in my circumstances anyway, was that I feel like I can give my love freely to Suze, as opposed to it being something that anyone expects of me. You know, like I've had lots of friends over the years who, funnily enough, have had brothers and sisters with a disability, because funnily enough, we're everywhere. And yeah, like, it's always been a topic of conversation, and I have had a real sense that for my friends who have a very difficult relationship with their brother and sister, they often feel, often guilt is a really, really big feature, and I think I'm really lucky, again, as a part of who we are, that Suze has never made me feel guilty either, which I feel really lucky for. So I'm quite happy to make my brother feel guilty, but we can rest assured that Suze is pretty easygoing on both of us. So again, there's this sort of notion about when something can be freely given, and that leads me to my next point, that it's really opened up a space for me to kind of appreciate the reciprocity in my relationship with Suze. A lot of the time, I guess because Suze and I do a lot of stuff together, people see us out and about a lot, and I'm always talking about, you know, organising your 40th or doing something or other, and people will be like, oh, you're such a good sister. And I'm like, yeah, you keep telling me that, I'm quite happy to hear that, but actually, when it doesn't suit me, I don't do it. You know, like, I do this because I actually really enjoy hanging out with Suze, and I really enjoy the kind of different, because you are really not like anyone else in the world, and it's a great opportunity to sort of hang out with someone who's not like anyone else in the world. And I don't mean that kind of tokenistically. I really, and again, I think because I've been able to freely give this relationship, that I've had the chance to really appreciate what I get out of the relationship, as well as what I give to it. So that sort of sense of reciprocity, I think, is really good. I think being a connected family has been a really helpful thing in shaping my relationship with Suze, because our family have always been really closely connected to lots of other families. We've always lived in the same house, but we come from, I guess, a community of faith, and that community of faith was actually one that where it's involved us meeting with other families throughout a lifetime. So we've got some friends who are kind of almost like family, really, and that's been really important, I think, for me to feel like we're not kind of doing it alone, which sounds like a silly thing, but it's really important. And so also lately we've started up a circle of support for Suze, and that's been really helpful too, and I'd love to talk more about that if anyone wants to talk about it. The last thing I want to sort of talk about is something I'm calling an overarching narrative, or how we define ourselves. And I wasn't really sure what you guys would be wanting to hear about today. But often when people ask me about what it's like to be a sibling, they're often a parent, and they're often saying to me, how do I make sure my son or daughter who has a disability, that his brother and sister, that they're going to be okay? And I, that's really, that's a kind of a big question, which is fine. But I think what I want to say is that the advice that I would give to a family where there is a child with a disability is the same advice I would give to any family, which is connect the story of your family to an overarching narrative, that not the kind of narrative that's all about how life is really tough and we're doing it really well, but that life is ordinary. Rhiannon talked about the word ordinary, and I think that's a really powerful word to use, that life has its ups and its downs, and that everyone's life has its ups and its downs. And how we kind of define our life and the overarching narrative that we sort of connect it to is sort of going to be something that leads us to, it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy in some ways. I read this amazing article on Huffington Post that says that families have 3 different overarching narratives. One is we started at the bottom and we worked our way to the top. The second overarching narrative was we used to have it all and now everything is difficult. And then the third narrative, which is apparently the most healthful narrative, is our life has its ups and its downs, and the life of our family before us had its ups and its downs. So again, it's funny that I've come full circle to my dad, whose genealogy I used to find really annoying, having to traipse around graveyards as a child all the time. I can see now the importance of connecting our lives to the lives of not just the people around us, but to the people who've come before us, to help us see that things that happen for us are normal. Because they are. I love that. Whose presentation was it who said disability is normal? Man. Yeah, Patrick, that was fantastic. I can't agree more than that. So if I had any advice, I would be for you to go away and think about, well, what is the story of my family? If I was some sort of historian writing the story of my family, what would that story be? What would the opening paragraph be? Would it be a story about tragedy? Would it be a story about things being difficult? Would it be a story about how sometimes they're difficult, sometimes they're great, and they're often something in between? I would also, as Rhiannon said, I would nurture slow growing seeds of connection, having that circle of support. We put a lot of work into our circle of support the first couple of years it was around, and in all honesty, we've met once this year. But I know that they're there. And so for me, it's almost kind of a bit of a relief that I don't have to organise those flaming meetings every 2 months anymore, which is great. But I know they're all there, and those seeds are slow, but they are growing. And that when mum and dad are gone, or when I'm really busy with my kids, that those people are there, which is great. And build embeddedness. So on my first slide, I had a thing, my favourite quote in the whole world, which is this one from Lilla Watson, who was an activist with the Aboriginal Tent Embassy, which says, it's the Loonig one. That is my favourite quote of all time. And on our circle of support, where we take notes, we write down, if you've come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you've come to help because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. When we started the circle of support, I was experiencing a few guilt issues about how can we ask all my busy friends to come and spend time on my stuff. And one of my friends, who is just a genius, said, sorry, Alison, our liberation is tied up with Susie's liberation. We're not here because you're asking us a favour. We're here because we're all in this together. And so that's been really helpful for me. Let us live in such a way that when we die, our love will survive and continue to grow. And for me, what that means is that I might go away again. I lived away for a couple of years in Dublin, and I lived away for 6 years in Sydney. And there's a chance that might happen again. Sue's just turned 40, and I think she's in a lot better health than I am. So there's all possibility that I'm going to shuffle off the mortal coil before she does. And so everything that I'm trying to do with Suze, when it's development work, I'm trying to build embeddedness for Suze so that she is not relying on me to make it happen for her, but that eventually they will be things that just happen. Anyway, I think I'm preaching to the converted on that one because I'm sure you all agree. So I'll pass it over to Maureen.